Jordan, are we on the call?
Hi, Mark. If you're ready to begin, then it's up to you.
Okay, very good. Sorry, I was having disconnected and logged on a second time to make it work. So,
No problem.
Yep.
We can see and hear you.
All right, very good. We got enough people on to get started then. Why don't we, I guess I'll go ahead and read the advisory, COMA advisory, and then Jordan, I'll ask you to, if you wouldn't mind, go through the roll call, and then we'll get started with the agenda. Pardon me. So the COMA advisory for this is that due to health and safety concerns, members of the public are not in attendance at this meeting, but full access to the meeting is being conducted by a medium of interactive communication, allowing members of the public without cost to listen to the meeting through the use of a live stream audio and video broadcasting on the internet. Information on how to access this meeting was sent out with the notice for this meeting. Any documents presented during the meeting will be available for the chair and the members of the commission who may be contacted using the email address listed in the meeting notification. Each member of the commission will state their names and title each time they begin to speak or vote, so that the individual can be readily identified by remote listeners. All participants are required to ensure that microphones, phones, other electronic devices are muted and the participants are not speaking, so that the ability of remote listeners to observe or hear the proceedings is not unnecessarily impeded. Public comment will not be allowed at this meeting. During the meeting, the commission will not recess to a closed or executive meeting pursuant to KSA 754319. And each motion, if any, will be clearly stated before the commission votes, and the chairperson will announce the results of the final vote. So that's the advisory. And Jordan, if you would run through the roll call. Mark Bennett, chair, present.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Owens.
Present.
Thank you. Senator Haley. Senator Wilborn.
Here.
Representative Finney.
Present.
Chief Ackerman.
Here.
Jennifer Basinger.
Here.
Judge Brown.
He let me know he was tied up today in court.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Sheriff Carr.
Present.
Judge Clark.
Present.
Professor Francis.
Present.
Chad Harmon.
Present.
Spence Keene.
Here.
Tabitha Owen.
Present.
Sylvia Pinner.
Present.
Thank you. Bill Persinger.
Present. Thank you.
Professor Phillips.
Present.
Pastor Robertson. Shelley Williams.
Present.
Reggie Robinson. General Schmidt. Director Schultz.
Good afternoon. I am present.
Thank you. Secretary Zamuda, I believe I saw Randy Bowman on for Secretary Zamuda. Is that correct?
Correct. Randy's here.
Thanks, Randy. And staff, I'll go ahead and note the staff. Connie Bonner, I believe I saw her on the call.
Here.
Bob Gallimore.
I'm here.
Myself, Jordan Milholland is here. Malaysia Shagun.
Here.
I'll also note that Martin DeBoer from KLRD is also on the call. Jenna Moyer.
Present.
Natalie Scott.
I'm here.
Jason Thompson.
Here.
And then I'll also note that we have a number of staff from the Council of State Government's Justice Center. Patrick, let us know who's here, if that's okay with him.
Yep. He said, let you know who's here right now, right, Jordan?
Mm-hmm.
We have Greg Hall, Rachel Druckhammer, Carl Reynolds, Celine Bianco, Laura Vanderlook, David Demora, Jen Casella, Sarah Wurzberg, and one second, Josh Gaines, and Erica Nelson.
Thank you, Patrick. Is there anyone else who is not covered by our roll so far?
Jordan Mill, this is David Haley, State Senator Haley. Can you hear me?
Thanks, Senator. We'll note you as present. Thank you.
Thank you, Jordan.
Is there anyone else who we may not have read their name yet? Okay, I'll hand it back over to the chairperson. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. Mark Bennett, Chair. The agenda this afternoon is we've set out some time, about 90 minutes, for the Council of State Governments, Mr. Armstrong and his folks, to present to us. They've been going around the state gathering information and have been providing that information to the various subcommittees relevant to the specific information they've been gathering. I've heard a few of these presentations in two different subcommittees I've been a part of, but I think this will be beneficial to the commission as a whole, because as we get together again next month for the next two meetings, at this point, these are the last two meetings authorized currently by statute for this commission to be involved in, and we need to get geared up toward our December 1st final report. Again, I think people on the call know this, we are asking for an extension of time to have the commission last another year, but in the interim, we do have this final report to gather. So this is information designed to inform our decisions that we're going to be making over the next 2 weeks, or next two meetings rather, as we put together this final report. So with that, Patrick Armstrong and the folks from the Council for State Government's Justice Center, I will turn this over to you.
Thank you, Chairman Bennett. And I believe my colleague Greg Hall is going to share his screen so that we can all be following the same presentation. And thank you, Jordan, for coordinating for us so that we're all able to see and look at the same thing here. As Chairman Bennett mentioned, first of all, I want to thank you all, the Chairman and Vice Chair Owens and all the commission members, for giving our team the opportunity to work with you all during this process. And as we get started with this presentation, I want to flag at the outset that the chat Zoom function, if you guys have questions that pop up as we're talking through these slides, please feel free to chat those to everyone. Thankfully, we have Greg on our team who is watching that chat box for us and going to make sure that as you all ask questions, we're going to pause a few times during the conversation to give us a chance to address anything that might come up. So we're going to go ahead and move on to slide 2 here, that you all have the framework of what we're thinking of walking you through today. And you'll see that at the outset, we're going to start out by talking about our work with the Commission with Justice Reinvestment. Second, we want to focus a little bit on the current challenges that you all have been facing and talking about over the last year. Third, we want to talk about the assessment work that we've been doing with the subcommittees. And lastly, we want to talk next steps. Next slide. And this is just a reminder that myself, Greg, and Rachel are the core team supporting the work in Kansas. And we're going to hop now to slide 6, because you already know about our organization and the process just in general. And in slide 6, we talk about how we're tied to this commission specifically and the goals that you all have been undertaking. And we know that you all have been very interested in making sure that first and foremost, public safety remains the focus of the work that you all do. We know recommendations are going to come out, but anything that you all decide as a commission, want to make sure that safety of the citizens of Kansas is at the forefront, as well as reducing recidivism. And these 4 bullets that we flag here are familiar to you all as members of the commission, because your subcommittees in large part mirror some of these topic areas. So we start out with the first bullet, wanting to make sure that Kansas can better manage the prison population pressure that exists. Second bullet, we want to make sure we increase support for victims of crime. Third, focused on strengthening community supervision, specifically to help change behavior of people in the system so that they can do better going forward. And lastly, want to ensure that the resources that exist in the state are focused on breaking the cycle of recidivism and making sure that folks have access to the resources they need to succeed. And that goes from the mental health and substance use treatment types of resources to also employment and housing support and things of that nature. Next slide. Next slide again. Here you'll see that we want to remind folks of all the assessment work that has been taking place. As Chairman Bennett noted a moment ago, we've been working closely with all the subcommittees because these meetings that you all have monthly, like this one, there's not a ton of time to dive into the details of the nuance of the system. So thankfully, the subcommittees have been very generous with their time and working with us, helping us pull together a ton of information and data and connecting us with practitioners from across the state. And last week, they all spent a good amount of time with us, I think about an hour and a half each subcommittee, walking through some of the assessment findings that we've been pulling together with their help. And prior to this meeting, we sent out those presentations and those slides as background so that you all have an opportunity to see what was talked about in subcommittees that you may not have participated in. And ultimately, as Chairman Bennett mentioned, you all are working towards a very, very quick deadline of December 1st to get recommendations out. So we're going to continue to coordinate with you all and hopefully help develop some recommendations that'll help strengthen the system overall. And in this slide, once again, just flags that our team has been able to check in with stakeholders from 95 of the 105 counties, thanks to you all making connections for us. Next slide. And so here on our next few slides, we're just listing out our assessment team members so that you all see and remember. Folks, most of these people will be familiar to you because you've had a chance to connect with them during your conversations, but we have David, Josh, and Jen. Next slide. Erica, Carl, and Laura. Next slide. And Celine and Sarah. All of the assessment team experts have been working with the subcommittees and pulling together information, and they're going to continue to work with the subcommittees going forward to make sure that we can try to pull something together and help with those recommendations that you all are working towards. Next slide. So now jumping into the substance of the information we want to share here, we want to talk about some of those overarching challenges that you all are seeing as a state. And when this commission was formed, you all were focused on, again, public safety and reducing recidivism. Next slide. And as part of that focus, you all have had to look at the system in a very extensive and expansive way, all covering specific topics and diving into the nuance. But the overarching theme that you all now are faced with is this major budget shortfall of $1.37 billion that's expected going forward. And while you all are focused on the system and keeping citizens safe, it's important to recognize that you're working in a very different climate than you were last year as of today. And going forward, it's just not going to be an option for the state to operate business as usual with the system being as expensive as it is. Next slide. When we're looking at the criminal justice system, our team always likes to start with public safety as the focus and looking at crime rates. Now, this slide doesn't show it, but overall crime is down recently in Kansas, specifically property crime driving that decline. But if you break it out, property crime driving the decline. But if you break it out, if you separate violent crime and property crime and look at violent crime more closely, like we do on this slide, you'll see that violent crime's actually gone up in recent years and increased 14% from the years 2008 to 2018, looking at that slide on the left. And if you break that down further, in the bottom right-hand corner of this slide, you'll see that aggravated assaults are up 8%, and that's really the vast majority of violent crime, and that's driving the increase that you see on the left side, that 14%. And our assessment team members, Laura, David, and Celine, have been looking into this violent crime issues specifically and aggravated assaults and exploring the role of domestic violence in that data. And they've been hearing a lot of it during their assessment activities. Next slide. And some of what they've been hearing and learning, we share here. You'll see that overall, domestic violence reports have increased. We have heard from law enforcement and sheriffs that they have increased calls for violent in-person crimes overall. And when you look at domestic violence specifically, we've heard from folks that in some areas, double to triple the number of calls are being reported for domestic violence. And those increases, we know from folks in Kansas, they seem to be tied to a lot of the areas that the commission here is exploring, and those relate to a lack of substance use and mental health services. And also, the pandemic has made the issue a little bit more challenging because it's impacted the custodial sanctions that are available to respond to different types of violent crime. Next. When we look here, we wanted to include this slide from with the quote from Governor Kelly, because she captures really well, we thought, some of the topics and themes that have come up for you all in the conversations we're hearing. And that's first and foremost that the criminal justice system is very, very expensive. And to hold someone in prison for a year, it costs about $30,000. And you all have all talked about in the various subcommittees the need for increased substance use and mental health services and support, as well as treatment and programming and additional resources for people who need housing and employment. And as you all are thinking about the limitations and resources that are available across the state, it's important that we keep in mind the strain that you guys are under budget-wise. And obviously, this is also something that's being felt by other states because the pandemic has impacted everyone across the country. And you all remember this time last year, as you all were exploring these issues, Secretary Zamuda shared that the KDOC facilities were filled to capacity at the time, and the state was looking to send people to Arizona to hold folks in beds outside of the state because there was nowhere to hold folks. And that dynamic has changed since the pandemic has started. But we know that if you all it's important that you all do what you're continuing to do in these conversations, and that's explore how to do things a little bit differently, because operating how the folks state were operating about a year ago is just not feasible with the pressures that are available and existing in the budget. Now I'm going to move on to the next slide, and my colleague Carl is going to hop in to talk about the prison population pressures generally. Carl?
Thanks, Patrick. Hello, everyone. Chairman Bennett and members, nice to be with you this afternoon. I wanted to sort of preface my comments by saying that I've been working on a different project that involves conversations with paroling authorities around the country, including Jonathan Ogletree from Kansas. In fact, Jonathan has been one of the leaders of the project that I've been working on because of his leadership role with the Association of Paroling Authorities International. And Patrick reminded me of that with his last comment, because one of the themes that's come through in these conversations with peers talking to each other from around the country about what's going on is that they have found themselves adopting changes to practice around parole release decisions, around parole revocation decisions, around using video conferencing for a lot of their day-to-day work, and basically saying we feel like we've arrived at some places that we don't want to leave. We've found some efficiencies, we found some policy changes that have come to us because of dealing with an emergency, but they have overall, many things that we're doing now make sense to us as a matter of ongoing practice. So I think that is a theme that we're hearing all around the country, and certainly something we want to highlight here in Kansas. So this first graph is showing what's happened with prison admissions by month last year and then this year. Pretty obvious change in 2020. So this reflects not the complete closing, but a very a narrowing of the front door of your prison system so that fewer people are essentially allowed in the front door And of course, as well, fewer people are being processed for admission into prison as the justice systems at the local level constrict and stop operating as normal. Next slide, please. So this breaks down the previous slide between court action on the left side and KDOC action on the right side. And you can see how the dramatic decrease in admissions is fueled by both of those sources of action. Much smaller numbers on the right side by KDOC and larger on the left side. But both ends of the system kind of working in concert to diminish the admissions into the front door. Next slide. Interestingly, the back end of the system, total releases from prison on the left side of this slide, much more stable, certainly lower numbers than the prior year, but not the same kind of sharply downward bending curve. And I think that's an interesting illustration. And in fact, it has been illustrated in the conversations with paroling authorities that I referred to, in that most states around the country have seen pretty significant drop-offs in their prison population. And most states are seeing that happen because of changes to what's happening at the front door, as opposed to opening up the back door willy-nilly. So Kansas is no exception in that regard. But I do think there's sort of a little nugget of truth there, or a nugget of something that we all need to be thinking about, which is, you know, in this era, we've tightened the front door because of an emergency and because of circumstances that people could not have predicted. What would it look like to change the front door of our prison system, the most expensive part of our justice array, as a matter of public policy and of taking a hard look at who goes to prison and how long they stay? What would it look like to be able to sustain the kinds of the kind of drop off in pressure on our system that has happened to us over the last few months? Next slide. So this is showing the actual effect of those previous slides. The fairly sharp decline in 2020 from 2019, and of course your sentencing commission does very sophisticated projections of your prison population, and these lines are based on two of their projections, the one from last year in August and the one that just came out in August of 2020 with a much lower line, a lower population, but predicting a creeping upward just as before, just starting at a lower baseline. One of the things we noted is that if you were able to sustain your system at 9,189 people as opposed to about 10,000 people, that's a difference of some $22 million a year based on your average cost to house them in a prison of 26,000 plus per year. So they're implicit in these numbers is the potential, at least, for some cost savings if you can arrive at policy decisions that you feel comfortable with, that maintain the prison at that population. Greg, you're jumping a little ahead of me here. So go ahead and go to the next slide, 21. So this is really just restating what I stated, that that differential between 10,000 and 9,200 is roughly 22 million in incarceration costs. And again, if we can maintain public safety and do a better job of interrupting recidivism, we might be able to sustain this reduced number of people who are incarcerated in Kansas. Next slide. These next couple of slides I put together when I started looking at the information that was coming out of Kansas in the last few months and seeing the information that our team of assessment experts has been gathering and the data that Rachel has been analyzing. One thing that really jumped out at me, and I know it's absolutely no surprise to you all, is the pressure that drugs and drug abuse is putting on your justice system. And so this is just an assembly of sort of talking points, bullet points about the trend at several junctures in your system over the last decade or so. Total reported arrests have decreased, but arrests for drug offenses have increased pretty considerably. Felony drug cases filed in district court increased 125% over a 9 or 10 year period. And that means that they're squeezing out other cases in the district court caseload. They've gone from 13% of all the cases filed in district court to 27% in that same fairly short time period. So your courts are getting hit hard by the scourge of drug abuse. Next slide, please. Community corrections, people starting community corrections for felony drug offenses increased 52% in that same time period. Women, who are a growing phenomenon in your system and a large and certainly very affected by the drug issue. Women starting community corrections for felony drug offenses increasing 91%. A felony sentence overall for drugs increasing 63%. Sentences to prison increasing 79%, and sentence lengths even increasing over that time period from 38 to 43 months. So again, just pressure after pressure after pressure at each juncture in your system. And I know that phenomenon is nothing new to you all on this call, but I wanted to illustrate how it's numerically increasing at every turn. Next slide. So this is an illustration by your drug sentencing grid of all the people that are getting sentenced to prison for drug possession and drug distribution. And if you look at the lower left-hand corner of this graph, in the sort of shaded gray box, that's where we're getting the point that we're making in the title, that of all the people that went to prison for drug offenses in 2019, 27% were people with no prior felonies, based on the way their grid computation was done. These are people with possibly 2+ misdemeanors or 1 misdemeanor or no record, but no prior felonies. Of course, that number is a little different between possession and distribution. You've got about 400 people coming to prison for possession with no prior felony history, and another 178 coming to prison for distribution with no prior felonies. Now, of course, plea bargaining affects these numbers, and you cannot see plea bargaining, you cannot see charge bargaining reducing what people are ultimately being convicted of and being sent to prison for. So we understand that, you understand that. It's not reflected in the data, so it cannot be quantified, but it is certainly a reality in Kansas and in every other system. But there is still this phenomenon of a fair chunk of people getting sent to prison for drug possession and drug distribution without any prior felony history. Next slide, please. And so this is the prison population on hand. This is not admissions, it's on hand population, and the percentage of that population that is people who were convicted of drug offenses, which has increased 55% from FY10 up to FY19, to the point where now it is 16% of the on-hand population in your system. And the number of people that are in prison for drug offenses has increased 3 to 4 times more than the other broad categories of population in your system. So again, just underscoring this point that if we could do more about drug offenses and come up with ways to keep people from ending up in prison for that kind of an offense, your system could save a lot of money and hopefully increase public safety by a better job of reducing recidivism. Next slide, please. The number of women in prison for drug offenses has increased dramatically. Not huge numbers, but 103 up to 220 over the last decade, 114% increase. Of course, the men have increased in absolute numbers even more so. Looks like about 400 more men in prison, and that's a 49% increase in men coming to prison for drug offenses. So this is a phenomenon across genders, but a more marked trend in terms of what's happening with women in your system. Next slide, please. So looking at that, your state is fortunate in that you're using the LSIR and doing a good job for the most part with actually assessing people for their risk levels using the LSIR. And what we can see because of that is through data analysis that most admissions to prison for drug offenses are people with high to medium level of LSIR scores. Next slide, please. So again, using average cost per day and cost per year of $26,000 plus for each person in your prison system, we estimate that $41 million could be saved, or that you're spending $41 million to incarcerate people for drug offenses last year. Next slide, please.
And we're actually going to pause for a moment on this slide. Thanks, Greg. And because the chat function is not allowing folks to chime in with questions typing, we want to pause and give folks a moment to hop in and ask any questions on the information you've heard up to this point so that we can try to see if we can answer it for you. So I'll pause. Questions? Just giving folks a moment to find their mute buttons in case they
Patrick.
need to. Yeah.
Oh, this is Senator Haley.
Thank you, Senator.
Oh,
Feel free to go ahead.
I'm sorry, I didn't know if I were unmuted. This is most informative. I'm appreciative of both of your reviews to this point. Of course, ongoing concerns about the incarceration for the first time offenders for especially the possession, low-level possession, non-felony. But getting back to the earlier part, I appreciate that correlative that you brought in the initial part of this review on the increase in especially violent crime. Interesting that maybe burglaries and home invasions are down, but in my area, my part of the world, I'm in Kansas City, and I don't know if this same trend is prevalent more in an urban environment like Kansas City. I don't know if Chair Bennett is experiencing this and finding a greater prosecution in his home county of Sedgwick County in Wichita. But in Kansas City, there has been brought in a federal or a national initiative specifically to look at the regional urban unprecedented increase in homicides and other violent crime. And I don't know if you have had an opportunity or if CSG was aware of that. The initiative is though it's primarily focused in my area in Kansas City, Missouri, working in conjunction with the Kansas City, Missouri. There's been quite a bit because Kansas City, Kansas, Wyandotte County, my county, is trying to make sense of it all. And so as you brought the earlier part of your presentation, I'm most struck as we look at ways to bring about reform by the concern of the spike during this particular time, whatever's driving it, pandemic, what have you, and also what other national models may show. If this is something that we're seeing consistently in other parts, since of course CSG is in the has the advantage of looking at it, because I personally just don't understand it. And I'm sorry to take so much of the committee's time, but as we look at reform, I'm also trying to look at the arguments, teleological and otherwise, as to why something can throw all the models that we have out of whack if it's a pandemic or what have you. So there can be some other time, I guess, to muse over this. We're in the midst of another part of this this discussion, but I just thought I would bookmark and ask for your insight at the appropriate time. Thank you, sir.
Patrick, this is Mark Bennett, Chair. Just a couple comments, and then turn it back over to you. Just to clarify a couple things, the possession cases are not low-level non-felonies. If it's a non-felony, they don't go to the penitentiary. So if they're included in this discussion and in the KDOC numbers, these are folks who are convicted, maybe possession, but it's a felony possession, meaning talking about methamphetamine, heroin, things like that, cocaine. Marijuana would not be included in this unless you've been convicted twice before and picked up a third felony. I think one other thing to remember here as we're talking about this is that people who get a felony for possession only with no criminal history, that 27% that was referenced earlier, would be placed on probation. And there would be, at least up until 2019, there were a whole host of hurdles they'd have to go through before a judge could revoke their probation. So I think part of this, again, speaks to the inability for folks to take full advantage of probation and what we could do to make those sort of treatment options and things more readily available so they wouldn't violate their probation over and over again and finally get sent to the penitentiary. So just one point. The last thing I'd say is trying to make good use of time here. Yeah, Wichita's also involved in that same project. I believe it's the same one you're thinking of, Senator. It's called the PSP. Our homicide rate has gone up exponentially over the last few years. Drive-by shootings are up over 100% this time last year. We were 50% increase this time last year to homicides. We've already had more homicides in Wichita than we did in all of 2019 so far this year. Property crimes, meaning not burglaries or home invasions, as you mentioned, but things more like forgeries, theft, things like that are considerably down. So the overall crime rate's down, but these markers for violent crime are up in Wichita. And my understanding is in most of the major urban areas of the United States are having something similar. At least many are. Violent crimes up while property crimes are way down. And so it gives a kind of a mixed bag.
This is Chief Ackerman. I had one thing for you, Patrick. When you're looking at the differences in the last 6 months on the graphs that you were showing us for crime, the differences of people in prison, do you have the numbers of, like, say, last March to the previous, say, October? Over time, are they normal, not spreading like they obviously are with the COVID? But what do you think is the difference between the previous years? Are we right on top as the same? Would the graph bars be neck and neck and not drop like they did for COVID? Or were we seeing a spread before COVID hit, do you think?
Thanks for the question, Chief Ackerman. To clarify, well, first, thank you, Senator Haley, for jumping in with the feedback on the PSP program that you all are working on, and Chairman Bennett as well for the additional context on violent crimes in Wichita and what you all are seeing in that project. And Chief Ackerman, I want you to let you clarify your question for a minute, and I'm going to actually ask my colleague Laura to hop in to talk a little bit about violent crime, since both Senator Haley and Chairman Bennett mentioned it. So first question for you, Chief Ackerman, are you referring to a particular slide, the one that's
slide? Yeah, the slide for the prison population, how it's dropped dramatically, because of COVID. And because, I think common sense would tell us that as soon as the courts open back up fully, we're going to see a spike. But prior to the last 6 months, like you have on the slide, are the numbers continuing to climb over the last few years? Are they the same? Or, I'm trying to look at the difference in prison populations over, say, the last 3 years, not COVID time. Where were we heading before COVID hit us?
Oh, yeah. Well, and I'll quickly jump in on that before it turned into Laura for the violent crime issue. Yeah, prior to COVID hitting, the slide that we have the prison population projections on, it's slide 20 of the deck, that should be either 19 or 20 because we added a slide. But the prison population was on the way up, and that was thanks to Scott Schultz and his team showing the trend over years. That slide either 19 or 20 with the prison population, there's a dotted line on there that shows prior to COVID, the population was expected to go up considerably over the next 10 or so years. At the time when Scott and folks did their projections, it was going to go up 14% in the next 10 years. And on the slide that you all have in front of you, you'll see that there's a dotted line that goes from the current population amount up to about 11,000. So it was on the rise, Chief Ackerman, prior to COVID. But since COVID, there has been a dip, and Scott and his team reworked the projections. So that has impacted what's going to happen going forward. Does that answer your question, Chief, that the population was projected to go up previously?
Yes, it does. I was wondering about the past. We all, like I say, I think common sense tells us whenever the Betty gets back and the parole board everybody gets back to work, that we're going to see a small spike. And I think that's something we always need to keep in consideration, that these numbers are not going to hold where they're at now.
I think that's a good point, Chief. And one of the things that we're glad that you all are thinking about as a commission is if the numbers don't hold and they begin to spike, or what can we do as a commission to make smarter decisions about those folks, where they're going and how we're dealing with them. First and foremost, to change behavior, but also if you're changing behavior, do what Chairman Bennett just mentioned, and that's giving people resources in supervision earlier on in the process so that they don't reoffend and continue to cycle through, and then increase that number and have that spike shoot up too high. But you're exactly right, Chief Ackerman. I want to ask my colleague Laura if she wouldn't mind jumping in and commenting on the violent crime pieces that Chairman Bennett and Senator Haley mentioned. Laura, is that okay?
That is. Thanks, Patrick. Hi, everyone. This is Laura Vanderlucht from CSG. And myself and my colleague David Demora are really working with the violent crime assessment in your state. And Senator Haley, I wanted to just give brief comments because I know we have a lot of material to get through today. But you know, first, what you're saying, and that we are in unprecedented times in terms of some of the patterns that we're seeing, both in Kansas as well as nationwide, in terms of violent crime. You know, both reported offending and then what we know to be, you know, that sort of hidden figure of crime, of crimes that don't come into the purview of law enforcement. And so, you know, it sounds like you're experiencing in Kansas City is certainly what we're seeing in a lot of the other urban areas, and that we're seeing really high rises in violent crime and homicides in particular in recent months, I should say, you know, since March. And that, as Patrick walked us through some of the, you know, longer trends in Kansas, you know, that is an exacerbation of some of the violent crime trends that have been occurring in terms of an increase in Kansas since about 2013. That is not to say, and I want to be very clear, that violent crime increases across the state are only urban problems. We are hearing both qualitatively from the very many conversations we've had with law enforcement, as well as victims advocates, as well as community supervision, that there are increases in calls for service across the state, you know, especially in rural areas. That's really starting to wear thin the resources of law enforcement in particular, which is in turn made more difficult because of the lack of access to other supportive resources in the community. And so we really are seeing an intersection of complicated factors in Kansas, especially in COVID. And I think Chairman Bennett, to pull in your comment to this analysis, is that, you know, as we are in this sort of unprecedented time of a backlog of cases, as well as, you know, courts and Chief Ackerman, as you said, you know, the parole board not functioning in ways that are typical by any stretch of the imagination. You know, we are in this place where it's difficult to have real-time data to be able to compare to previous, even recent trends. And so that's why our team is really focused on making sure we are talking to as many people as possible, as systematically as possible across the state, to be able to understand in a really comprehensive way what's happening now. And to my colleague Carl's point, what changes can or should be sustained going forward in terms of recommendations for reform, and also what isn't working well, and where especially the communities need more support. And lastly, I will say, Senator Haley, I would love to connect with you to talk more about your your PSP program, and also let you know that I worked on a previous project through CSG with the state of Missouri and have had extensive conversations with the Kansas City No Violence Alliance as well. And so certainly would be willing to chat about that or make connections where you haven't already. So I'll turn it back to you, Patrick.
This is David Haley. Thank you. I welcome that, please.
Great.
Please.
Great. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, folks, for chiming in with comments and questions. I'm going to now move us on to slide 29. So back to the presentation, and we're going to talk a little bit about condition violators and their role in the system. And as Carl mentioned a moment ago, this drug issue, substance use issue, is a pretty glaring one that you all have talked about at length for a while. And the other large volume of people coming into the system can be found when we're looking at people who are on supervision, who violate and end up going to prison, not for new convictions for a new crime, but for violations on supervision or being sanctioned while they're on probation. So if we're looking at this slide here, on the far right, you'll see that the orange bar shows this is prison admissions, people going into prison, that folks on community supervision with supervision violations make up 58% of all admissions. So a pretty large chunk of the people coming to prison are coming while serving time on probation or parole. And that gets at Chairman Bennett's point a moment ago of trying to do better with these people here at this stage in the game when they're on supervision, so they're not continuing to violate and cycle through the system. And within this 58%, if you dive down even further into the number, we don't show this here, but the majority of the folks here are going to prison for condition violations. So things like missing a meeting or failing a drug test, not abstaining from alcohol, things of that nature. Those supervision condition violations are reasons that folks are violating, some of the reasons amongst others that they're violating and going back to prison. Next slide. And on this next slide, we focus specifically on parole revocations and people going back to prison after serving time on parole. The last slide was both probation and parole, and this zeroes in a little bit. And the reason we narrow it and focus it on this population in particular and break it up by gender is because it shows, again, the extreme increase of women going to prison for various reasons, in this particular for parole condition violations. If you look at that second set of bar graphs where we list condition violations of women, and at the top you see it's up 78% from 2010 to 2019, that's a huge jump, we think, from the number of women who were going to prison or being revoked for condition violations. And obviously, when you look at both men and women side by side, the number of men in the system vastly outnumber women, but that still doesn't take away from the fact that we should dive into and do need to dive into what's happening with women in these different parts of the system, as Carl also mentioned in that previous drug slide. Next slide.
Hey, Patrick.
Yes, sir.
This is Sheriff Carr. Back on the condition violations, I think it needs to be noted as well. Many of these people that are violating, they're not single violations either. Working hand in hand and being on the board here, many of these people are violating 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times before they're also being sent back. So it needs to be clarified that it's just not that they didn't show up for a single meeting. Just last week, as an example, one of them was to go to treatment. Treatment providers called him, I don't know how many times. POs called him several times. He's been into court, but at least 7 occasions he's still not went. So, I mean, basically he's going to go to prison. So I think we need to make sure that's clarified as well.
Thank you, Sheriff Carr. That is additional context that is helpful. And to that point, it's actually next slide, Greg, because it kind of touches on the comment that you raised, Sheriff. And because we start to look specifically at the types of violations that are most commonly flagged at these revocation hearings, and this is now back to probation. The last slide was parole. But when you're looking at probation hearings, to Sheriff Carr's point, when folks go to these hearings, they oftentimes are not going for just one violation. So it wouldn't be just failure to report or maybe just missing the program or treatment. Sometimes it's many different violations that are being reviewed in that one hearing. And Sheriff Carr's point is not only about the hearing and what's listed there, but what has built up over time, folks' behavior on supervision, if they're not showing up, not responding to calls like the sheriff mentioned, where it's important to recognize that these are challenging people and think about if they're violating to the point that Sheriff Carr mentioned, what can we do? And this goes back to Chairman Bennett's point. What can we do to people at this stage to watch them closer, hold them accountable, make sure that if they're stepping out of line, that behavior is recognized and acknowledged and dealt with? What can be done with folks, these people ahead of time, in the event that, with the hope of changing that behavior pattern so they can stop violating and then stop ending up in prison like they are? But it was a good point to raise and a good one to flag, because even here, when we're listing out all the reasons for violations, each hearing might have several of them, and then even beyond the hearing, there's several violations that need to be taken into account and made note of. And you'll see the top 3 violations. If we look at the far left of this slide, the total, and those bar graphs under the total, the light blue line shows people who had failure to report as a reason for their violation hearing. The dark blue line next to that, the next highest, is people who failed the drug test. And I'll stop at the third line there, the red line, 28%, and that's folks who failed a program or treatment. And these are all reasons that you all have talked about as a commission, that while some of them tie pretty clearly to substance use issues and drug issues, like missing treatment or failing a drug test or failure to abstain from using alcohol, it speaks pretty clearly to substance use issues in the state, but also even failure to report, the largest one, we can probably understand that many times that's connected to substance use issues as well. And this is just, it's new. It's not news to you all, because this is stuff that we've heard from you, but it's worth teasing out that the drug issue that Carl walked us through is not divorced from this condition violator issue that we're talking about now. Next slide. And again, we try to quantify what that's costing the state. And here we'll see that it costs about $43 million in 2019 to incarcerate people for condition violations. And that's 10 times as much as it would cost. Well, if you look at how much it costs per day to incarcerate somebody and compare that to how much it costs per day to supervise somebody in the community, it's about 10 times as much that it costs to deal with people if you put them behind the walls in prison. Next slide. And again, that really just drives home the point that you all are grappling with in Kansas, and that's in this current budget crisis, that doing things how they've been done in the past is just factually not possible because of the budget constraint that you all are under and the way that the system is already strapped for resources. And prior to COVID, you all as a commission talked about the need to make sure that there was more support for people who are doing the work, the practitioners on the ground level, law enforcement, supervision officers, treatment providers, and people in the system who were either on supervision or being released from prison, finding ways to increase the resources at their disposal to, again, change that behavior, make sure that if they're doing those things that they shouldn't be doing and struggling with addiction or missing meetings, that there are ways to be smarter with how Kansas is spending money so that that behavior can actually change, as opposed to what's happening now is the state is spending a ton of money on prison, but it's not necessarily doing anything to impact behavior. They're spending those resources, holding people for long periods of time, releasing them back into under-resourced communities, and then still dealing with them over and over. And then you end up with the example that Sheriff Carr just mentioned of folks just continuing to be an issue. So we'll stop here one more time for questions before moving further. Questions?
This is Spence Cohen.
Hi, Spence. Thanks for hopping in.
I'm sorry, I didn't say I'm the court services specialist with the Office of Judicial Administration. I again just wanted to reiterate kind of what Sheriff Carr stated earlier, and then you would address. But as a probation officer, and I know community corrections and court services both do a great job, and I just want to make sure people understand when we're looking at condition violators, you broke it down into missed appointments, drug tests, failing to do treatment. That, when I was an officer, I never saw anybody that would take someone back to court for not reporting a job, if they lost a job. It's important for everybody to understand that correct, or, our supervision is built to try to help people as much as possible. And it's not that it's just one or two things, or they missed an appointment and a drug test. Those things are being addressed. And it might be more of a, how do we finance drug treatment or mental health treatment versus supervision isn't addressing these issues, or just taking people back immediately if they're missing one appointment or not working. It's, there are multiple chances being given to people across the state with community corrections and services. So, I think it seems, at least for me, when I've been an officer, it seems a little misleading when we hear people say, you're going back to prison because you didn't report. And kind of like Sheriff Carr said, it's usually multiple opportunities are given. And I would see it more as maybe, someone's not doing treatment, but, if it costs $500 to get an evaluation, they can't afford that. And so we need to really allocate, resources to those type of people. So I just, it's not so much of a question as just an observation. So thank you, Patrick.
Absolutely. Thanks, Spence. And if we can go back to that slide that we're referring to, slide 31, with those reasons for hearings, because to Spence's point, he's exactly right. It's not usually just one of those things. You'll see there the green bar on the far right of each of these is something like failure to, report a change of job or residence, and that's something listed as at times when people go back, a reason that they are flagged for violations. And to Spence's point, it's never just that one thing. Those are probably the instances where it's a ton of things happening, one of which is failure to report a change in job or something along those lines. Many things happening, one of which is one of the lower level, a small thing. So just like Spence mentioned and Sheriff Carr and Chairman Bennett a moment ago, there's a lot of things happening with these folks, and Spence echoed it as well just now, and that could mean just finding more resources for those folks. Because we agree in our supervision team that includes Laura and Jen and David and folks who have been assessing that part of the system would echo what Spence just said, and that the folks who are supervising on court services, community corrections, and parole are all working really hard to respond to violations and to work with these folks when they're having trouble. But there's just limited resources that those officers have at their disposal to help steer folks. And so just echoing what Spence just said, in that it's probably more of a resources are needed issue than it is the officers are doing something wrong. I want to keep a moment for other comments, questions. Giving folks, in case, mute buttons are giving us trouble as they do sometimes. All right. So now we're going to go ahead and move on to the next slide and begin to talk about some of the assessment work that our team has been leading. And I listed all of our team earlier who has been directly involved in all these conversations, closely connecting with people, and glad that we got to hear Laura and Carl jump in a moment ago about some of what they're seeing. But we want to look next at slide 36 here, because we want to quickly talk about some of what each of the subcommittees have been covering. And these slides here are just one slide of the many that we shared in the Substance Use and Mental Health Subcommittee slide deck. We want to highlight here one of the large issues that we're seeing as it relates to behavioral health. And that's, again, to what folks have been talking about to this point, the need for people to have certain treatment and services available to them. Here on this side specifically, we're looking at prison releases, people leaving prison, and there's about 4,000 or so people a year. You'll see year by year across these graphs. And the little blue bar at the top, the light blue at the top of all of these bars, is about a quarter of people who require some level of treatments and services when they're leaving prison and going back into the community. It's about a quarter of folks, or if you're looking at the far right, 1,200 or so people who had a mental health disorder level between 4 and 6. So that means when they're leaving, they need some of those resources that Spence and folks have alluded to when they're going out into the community. And obviously, mental health issues is not a huge problem only for people leaving prison going on parole, but this is something that you all are seeing across the board in the system. And mental health issues are not the only piece of this behavioral health puzzle. So I want to pause for a moment and see if my colleague, David Demora, who's leading our behavioral health assessment along with Sarah Wurzburg, see if there's any additional context he would like to provide as it relates to the assessment that he's been doing and or making a finer point on any of these issues that we've been flagging as it relates to the treatment and services. David, you want to jump in?
Sure, thanks, Patrick. Good afternoon, folks. Just a few quick additional points to round this out. The first one is that, of course, what you're seeing on this slide are specifically mental health needs. We certainly don't want to lose the fact that there are very many people that are leaving prison who have significant substance use needs as well, and as well as co-occurring disorder needs, both mental health and substance use. And so when we look at those service needs of people leaving prison, they are fairly large. And frankly, once you add in substance abuse, the service needs dramatically increase over and above mental health only, both extremely important, but we don't want to forget that. And then when we look at the challenges vary across the state, in part in response to one of the earlier comments. Everybody's working really hard and really deeply cares about working with this population that we've spoken with. But there are differences in supervision styles across the state. There's differences in program availability across the state, and there's differences in whether or not people are accessing the most appropriate programs for their particular difficulties or needs. So there's a series of different issues, and it's not a one-size-fits-all problem or one-size-fits-all answer. The solutions in some parts of the state will need to be different than in other parts. And as we continue to explore these issues and that correlation, if you will, between mental health and substance use needs, we hope to have additional recommendations and suggestions for you as to how to resolve hopefully a good number of those issues. So thanks, Patrick.
Thank you, David. Pausing here for a moment in case folks have either behavioral health related questions or anything that we've covered up to this point. If folks were thinking of something that they didn't get to raise earlier, also pausing to see if anyone wants to jump in with any comments or questions. All right, we're going to move on to the next slide. And as I do that and go into a different topic, I do want to know that, like I said, David and Sarah from our team are leading that behavioral health assessment piece, and they're working with the Mental Health and Substance Abuse Subcommittee that's led by Representative Owens, and those folks have been great about giving us information and helping us coordinate those pieces. So I want to make sure I mention that. And onto this slide where we're talking about the issue of employment. This again is another important thing that is comes to the forefront, and that's around February of this year, early before the pandemic hit, we worked with ks.gov to try to get a better understanding of how many people on parole were unemployed. And at the time, they estimated about 46% of the people on parole were unemployed. And again, before COVID. And so the statewide unemployment rate at that time was only about 3.2%. And still such a large number of people with criminal justice system involvement were unable to find jobs. And that feeds into the challenge that they're dealing with as they're trying to find stability and be successful and make sure that they are law-abiding citizens. We have to make sure that folks have access to the ability to work and be productive. So highlighting this number we thought was of importance, and it's a piece that our employment assessment team has been working on. That's Erica, Josh, and Greg, and they've been doing this work with the reentry subcommittee led by Professor Phillips and Representative Finney, with a lot of support from Margie Phelps from KDOC, who has a good pulse on all of a good read on the issues that are happening in the state related to this. So I want to pause for a moment for my colleagues first, Erica, Josh, and Greg, and see if they want to put a finer point on anything and clarify or provide broader context to the work that you all have been doing, and then turn it over to the commission once again for a question. So I'll pause for the team, Erica, Josh, Greg.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for having us today. I'm Erica Nelson, Project Manager at the Council of State Government's Justice Center, and I've been, as Patrick mentioned, working with my colleagues Josh Gaines, who actually specializes in criminal records areas within states across the country, but then also looking at occupational licensing in other areas. Also working with Greg Hall as well. So our assessment actually for employment and education has been twofold. We've been looking at structural barriers to career pathways to understand where there are possible opportunities to mitigate those structural barriers. So those are state statutes which are in place that may pose little to no risk to public safety, but prevent people from accessing careers and moving along that pathway. We've also been looking at workforce development programming for reentry populations to understand where there may be opportunities to increase access and to also ensure that it aligns with best practices. So as Patrick mentioned, we met with the Reentry Subcommittee last week, and you should all have a copy of the larger presentation that goes into the details of that, of what we shared. But I just want to highlight some key things. As Patrick mentioned, you have a large proportion of folks as of 2019 that were unemployed on parole. And there is even though the unemployment rate at that time was only 3.2%, given the current economy, every state in the U.S. is experiencing, as you know, some increase in unemployment. And in April 2020, the state unemployment rate was more than triple than what was reported in 2019. But what we know is actually as of July 2020, Kansas is ranked number 14 in the country for the lowest unemployment rate. But what we know is even from 2019, even if you have low unemployment rates, there's still a strong likelihood that people with criminal records are not going to be able to access employment. So we took a look at the high demand occupations in Kansas, and what we learned is that 80% of high demand occupation in Kansas require a high school diploma or a higher level of education. So out of 197 occupations, 42 of those required a high school diploma or higher. So we looked at those high demand occupations, but what we learned is actually the people who are in the Department of Corrections in Kansas, a large proportion of them do not have a high school diploma or a GED. And then when we looked at the number of people who are actually able to access these programs within the facilities, is a small portion, only about 700 people annually. And there's a large portion of folks that need these programming. So just to sum it up, it's a misalignment in terms of the skill sets of the people who are in the prison, who are eventually returning home to communities across Kansas. And then there's the high demand. And in terms of the high demand occupations, they don't have the skill sets to actually meet those career opportunities. And we know that the DOC doesn't necessarily have the capacity to provide services to all those who are in need. But one of the things I want to point out is that in Kansas, a large proportion of career opportunities require licensure for a range of jobs, either high demand jobs, some demands that are not necessarily in high demand, but there's a large proportion. So we presented to the Reentry Subcommittee some of our recommendations around increasing access to licensure. And we know that in 2018, Kansas actually made an important first step to maximizing access to licensure and minimizing still the risk to public safety. But we know that much more can be done to support the goals of these amendments that occurred in 2018 to further support what they were intended to achieve. So we shared a few best practices that we know around occupational licensing that can minimize the detail. But just to share with you, those things are to require a relationship between the offense and the duties of responsibilities of the licensing activity, and to require individual consideration of application. But there's a few more, but I'll pause right there because I understand that folks may have had opportunity to see those presentations, and I want to make sure that we get to actually the questions that are there. So I'll pause and see if the group has any questions with regards to the employment piece.
Thank you, Erica, for talking the group through some of the education employment assessment. And I'm going to pause one more moment just in case folks either have employment, education questions, or questions about anything else that has come up to this point. I want to leave the floor open for that as well.
Patrick, this is Sheriff Carr.
Thanks, Sheriff. Go ahead.
So a question I have, of the jobs, was that study conducted throughout the entire state of Kansas, or did you do it by region, northwest, southwest, southeast, north central, south central, or was it primarily in just the urban areas?
We looked through the entire state of Kansas. So you guys actually have a phenomenal Department of Labor that does some analysis, and they actually had the data right on the website. So we looked at the entire state, but you can also look at a breakdown by jurisdiction as well through the Department of Labor data.
Thank you.
This is Bill Persinger in Topeka.
Yeah, go ahead, Bill.
Oh, thank you. Very interesting so far. And I made quite a few notes and really appreciate the time you took to understand behavioral health and get more information there. And I just wanted to mention, or maybe you folks could check for us, are there specific housing and employment programs for people coming out of jail or prison? And I know just in the field of mental health, for an adult with a serious and persistent mental illness, schizophrenia, bipolar disease, there are some specific programs. One's called supported employment. The other one's called supported education. And they get some really nice outcomes. And I wonder if, not only for folks who, I think I might know what we would do here if an individual was coming out of was post-incarceration and had an active mental illness, what we could do in terms of housing and vocation, but just for maybe that percentage of individuals who do not have, maybe it's a level 1, 2, 3, or 4, a level of mental illness or addiction. Are there some models for employment and housing and having had family in that predicament? I can relate to that personally. And so I just want to ask, I just don't know enough to say what those might be.
I can jump in here. We are still looking at the landscape of what's available across Kansas in the community, but I do want to mention that there was a program called In Independence, Kansas, which was a partnership through the Vocational Rehabilitation Agency within the Department of Children and Family Services that worked with Region 1 Workforce Board, and they were doing some level of in-reach, but then also connecting people to supportive employment that have a diagnosed or documented disability. And this disability can include mental health, substance abuse, a number of different things. So that is a program that is supported, and it seems to have some promising outcomes. I know this month that program is ending and they're moving towards a little bit of a different model, but we'll be able to continue to provide services. So that's just one, but again, we're looking across the Kansas to learn more, but I'll ask others if they want to chime in within our group to share anything that they've found.
So this is Sarah Wurzburg, and I was just going to jump in on the housing piece. So for housing, there are some options for people who are returning to the community from Kansas Department of Corrections custody. That is not specific to people with behavioral health needs. And those are, one option is through potentially some of master leases that KDOC holds. And then when it comes to programs for people who are returning to jails who do not have behavioral health needs, there is some funding available through federal funding. So through Housing and Urban Development or HUD funds that people can access depending on how long they have been in jail to be able to access emergency funding for housing or shelters. So part of it depends on the circumstances and if they can meet the requirements to receive that funding. But as you mentioned, there also are programs that we have been discussing with various stakeholders that do address the intersection of housing, mental illness, and substance use disorder.
I might, this is Bill again. Chairman, if I could jump in for a second.
Yes, please. Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, I might mention, you know, of course, any best practices programs would be great to learn more about, not only for folks with a mental illness or an addiction, but those who do not have those severe kinds of problems. But it might at some point just get down to, does a staff member of a probation or a parole or a mental health or some other social service provider have the time to develop a cohort of employers and housing providers who will consider people with, you know, backgrounds that, you know, you take a look at an individual been in prison, they have a mental illness, that kind of thing. You know, I know in our support employment program here in Topeka, you know, we have, you know, a couple of hundred employers who are eager to work with individuals, adults that have a mental illness. And that's because we had enough staff to develop that group of individuals. And so it may just get down to staff time, somebody who can really develop that asset in the community. And if there are best practices, that would be even better. But sometimes it may just amount to staff time, which of course equates back to resources. So I don't want to add to the burden of all of that, but I do think that having staff who can specialize in these critical areas is very important to reintegration, successful reintegration, and the reduction of recidivism. And thank you, Chairman, for the time.
Thank you, Bill, for that comment and additional context. And I want to hold on this housing side for a moment because, Bill, you appreciate you segueing us right into this topic because it's an important one that we've heard a lot about from folks across different areas of the system. And you're right. Some of it has to do with it maybe being a resource issue, and that staff time piece is an important one that I know our team has been hearing about in the areas where they are able to connect people with employment and housing resources. It's because they have folks either locally or from KDOC who are making some of those connections that you mentioned, Bill. So I'm glad that you mentioned it. It's definitely important. I want to pause one more moment for more questions on any of these topics, and or if Sarah or others want to chime in on the staffing point that Bill made, want to leave space for that also. All right. Hearing none, we're going to move on to the next slide and talk a bit about community supervision. And thankfully, this community supervision work group has been very, very engaged and super helpful, just like all the others have been, on pulling together a ton of information and helping us connect with folks. And that group is led by Shelley Williams, and we're getting a lot of support from our end from Hope Cooper from KDOC, who has very instrumental in pulling together information that we need. And thankfully, Jen Casella from our team is leading that work so that we can get a better handle on what's happening in that part of the system to find ways to strengthen it. And this slide in particular, we're zoning in on some of the inefficiencies or duplication of effort that we were seeing. As we talked about earlier, folks in the system from court services, community correction, and parole are all working really, really hard and doing all they can to make sure that with limited support, they can help change behavior of people on supervision. But because of the way things are structured, they're sometimes put in challenging positions that require them to supervise individuals. Some individuals are supervised by multiple agencies. And we have here that first number of 1,200. There's estimated about 1,200 folks in the state who are on dual supervision. And if we look even further into that, some of those folks are supervised by all three entities: community corrections, court services, and parole. And because they're doing all this work, we're trying to think of ways to not make their days even harder, or find ways to take work from them that they don't need to be doing. And Jen will probably jump in and add more to this in a moment, but when the resources are already strained in the system, if you have folks doing some of the same things that others are doing, multiple assessments on people by both agencies sometimes are testing for drug and alcohol use. And obviously there's that burden that falls onto the people on supervision, where they need to pay supervision fees for more than one entity, or pay for tests that they have to take to more than one treatment provider. It's a huge burden, and there may be some ways to clean that effort up and make that part of the system work a little smoother. I'm going to pause for a moment and allow Jen, who's been leading some of this supervision work, to chime in, and possibly even Laura, who was steering the ship earlier in the process before taking on the violent crime piece. So I'll pause for our team. Jen, do you want to provide any insight, clarification?
Yeah, thank you, Patrick, Chairman Bennett, members of the commission. Jennifer Casella, Deputy Program Director with the CSG Justice Center. So really looking at community supervision, some of the themes that have been coming out around inconsistencies, around conditions of supervision across jurisdiction, as well as this dual supervision issue, which can actually span 4 agencies when you take a look at municipal probation as well, in access to resources and programming for folks who are on supervision. And I think, Spence, this really goes to kind of your comment, as well as Sheriff Carr, in that, you know, people are doing things for those condition violations for prison, for those revocations, but are there things going on within the community supervision system that are barriers to folks being successful in supervision? And I think this dual supervision kind of really highlights that. The low estimate that we have is that 5% of the folks who are on supervision are on multiple types of supervision in Kansas. Some of those estimates are as high as 16% that we've gotten more recently than when this presentation was developed. And so if you look at 15% of the supervision population, that's around 3,600 folks who are potentially on multiple forms of supervision across the state. Some of them are on multiple supervision with, you know, the same agency. For example, community corrections, they might be on community corrections in multiple jurisdictions. And when we looked at some case studies, which you'll find in the supervision report, you'll see that some folks are reporting 8-9 times per month to different supervision officers as a result. And so are there opportunities to create efficiencies, allow the supervision staff to work more effectively, and also at the same time reduce barriers to success for people who are on supervision? So those are some of the things that the Supervision Committee is taking a look at. And we'll be talking through some recommendations with them moving forward prior to the October committee meeting. So Patrick, I will turn it back to you for any questions that any folks may have.
Thank you, Jen. And can we go to the next slide, please, Greg? I'm going to open it up for questions on both the supervision and victims part in a moment. because I'm looking at the time here and want to make sure that we are mindful of what you all have to do following this presentation. And want to talk quickly about the challenges that victims face in the system. And thanks to Celine for leading our work on our team on this front. And she's coordinating mostly with the Proportionality and Guidelines Subcommittee led by Chief Ackerman. And this slide specifically, we're focused on crime victim compensation, but Celine helped report out to that committee last week and let them know that the state really has 3 ways that they're trying to support victims of crime pretty directly. One being program grants, the second being victim compensation, as we're talking about in this slide, and thirdly, victim restitution when folks are victims of crime. And in looking at this slide specifically, we call attention to the fact that the majority of people who are victims of violent crime, the majority of them do not apply for victim compensation. And if we're looking at the far left of this slide, the far right of this slide in 2019, that's 13,157. That's the number of violent index crimes that were reported. And we know that's likely a little bit different from the actual number of crimes that happen in Kansas. But the point of this graph is just showing that of all the crimes that happen, only a very small proportion of them, really that's that small blue bar at the bottom of there that says 1,436, a very small proportion of people who report violent crimes even apply for victim compensation. And with that type of disparity between the number of crimes and the number of applications, Celine is helping that group understand ways that they can increase accessibility of support for victims across the state, particularly as it relates to victim compensation, but also in the other areas that the state tries to support victims of crime. So I want to pause for a moment to allow Celine to provide clarification or put a finer point on any of the victim-related assessment work that's going on before turning it over for questions. Celine?
Thank you, Patrick. Chairman Bennett, Vice Chair Owens. I think Patrick clarified it well. The idea behind the assessment work that we're doing in Kansas and the work that we're doing with the Proportionality and Guidelines Subcommittee is really just, if we're going to be making changes to the criminal justice system that makes it more responsive to the risk and the needs of the individuals who commit crimes, then we also want to be making sure that we are centering victims at that conversation, and that we're also building infrastructure and making commensurate changes to make sure that victims have access to resources, that we're helping to provide supports, and that the state has various ways, as Patrick mentioned, that they can use different leverage to make sure that they're doing that, whether it's looking at Violent Victims of Crime Act funding that the state gets from the federal government through block grants, or as Patrick mentioned, increasing awareness of and access to the compensation program. The subcommittee is doing a lot of good work and having a lot of good conversations about some potential recommendations, and we really look forward to bringing those to this larger commission and brainstorming and collaborating with the subcommittee on how we can make sure that we're supporting victims of crime across the state.
Thank you, Celine, for putting a finer point on that, on this particular topic. And on that Proportionality and Guidelines Subcommittee, we thankfully are well represented by folks on the law enforcement side between Chief Ackerman and Sheriff Carr and others on that subcommittee. And we all know on this conversation, we opened the presentation with it. The point is public safety and making sure that victims have support, because these are the folks who are most impacted as we're talking about the criminal justice system. So keeping them at the center is going to continue to be an important theme of anything that we all work with the subcommittees to recommend. So I want to keep that at the forefront. I want to pause here to see if folks have comments, questions before we wrap up. And as folks are thinking, we just want to, these last few slides want to drive home the point that when we're talking about the assessment work that our team has been doing in Kansas with the help of the subcommittees, all of it is with this deadline coming up, as you'll see on the timeline slide here of the report that you all have. And while we're talking about things that Spence, Chairman Bennett, Sheriff Carr, Chief Ackerman, folks have flagged Bill a moment ago. You all have flagged the important piece of it, and that's in a bunch of these areas, resources and staffing time are really what's needed to make sure that people in the system are appropriately dealt with when they're not behaving, and they have the resources they need to get on track if they do want to get on track. And that's the big elephant in the room that you all talked about as a commission this time last year. You all said something on the lines of, look, the system is strained, and the folks in the legislature are going to have to understand that sometimes more resources are going to be needed in order to make sure that practitioners can do their job best and that people in the system can be rehabilitated. And if you're going to talk about that resource issue that you all raised this time last year, we can't talk about it without the current context and the current climate, understanding that this time last year, you all didn't have a $1.37 billion deficit to look at. And if you're going to do anything in these areas that you all have highlighted as very important, we have to think about where folks are going in the system, how they're being responded to when they're messing up on supervision, when they're messing up frequently. How do we help change that behavior early so that they don't end up in the most expensive part in the system with KDOC in the prison? So that really, I think, concludes what we want to run by the group. And you all have the slides from each of the subcommittees that we spoke to. And if you all have questions about those or about this presentation outside of this call, you all know that we'll be continuing to work with you going forward, and we'll look out for any emails or schedule calls with folks individually if that's easier to try to respond to anything that comes up. But thank you all for the time that you've been giving us and for giving us this time today to go to the presentation. Chairman Bennett?
Thank you very much, Patrick. Appreciate your presentation and the work that went into it. Well, at this time, we have scheduled a break. We've been at this for an hour and a half. Why don't we go ahead and take 5 minutes, give everybody a chance to stretch your legs. We'll come back. My clock shows 3:06. When we come back about, let's make it, 3:15 is the agenda. I guess that's probably appropriate. We'll take a break till 3:15, and I'll get us back on agenda after that and hear from the subcommittees. Thank you. Give everybody about a minute. We'll get started back up here. Okay, it's 3:15. We'll get started again. Next up, got the Diversion Specialty Courts, Specialty Prisons Supervision Subcommittee. We're going to get updates from our various subcommittees. So Spence Cohen is the chair of that subcommittee. Spence, if you're on, I'll turn it over to you.
This is Spence Cohen. I apologize. I'm having some video issues right now. Our committee has not met since August 5th, so it was before our last full commission meeting. I know Patrick and his group did a presentation with the supervision work group, or with our, with our subcommittee on the 9th. So our next meeting is set for the 21st, next Monday at 11 o'clock for our full committee. I know I've received, I think from the specialty prisons work group, I was on vacation last week, but I received their recommendations. So I will be forwarding that on after we review the our committee. I'll be forwarding that to you, Mr. Chairman, so that you can at least start getting those from our group pretty soon. So I don't know if anybody else on my committee has anything that they would want to add, any of the members. So I guess I'd ask that now, if you're okay with that, if anybody has any updates they want to give. But otherwise, our next meeting is the 21st.
Yeah, if there's any members, any chairs of the working groups of that subcommittee want to speak up, I'm on the diversion subcommittee working group of that subcommittee. I don't remember the last date we met, but we had at least one meeting. I'm going to circulate some more information to that group, but nothing new to report on that working group. Other working groups want to weigh in?
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Shelley.
Shelley Williams, and I'm chairman of the supervision work group. And I would just let the commission know that we have weekly meetings set between now and the next CSG presentation to our work group. And between now and that time, we're really going to be looking at how do we strengthen community supervision and resources to change behavior and reduce recidivism. And really those key points that we're going to be looking at is how do we shore up policy regarding conditions of supervision to meet best practices across the state and all three supervision entities? How do we address with policy dual and sometimes triple supervision of offenders? And then how do we get resources, both access and funding, to mental health, substance abuse treatment, and employment and housing support to all supervision entities? And of course, just looking at the number of women on supervision and gender responsivity, and how do we address the increase in the number of women on supervision? So those are kind of the things that we're going to be looking at over the next 3 weeks as a work group.
Very good. Other work group, let's see, specialty courts and prisons. Is there a working group? I'm trying to remember if there's a chair of that working group.
You would think I would know, Mr. Chairman, but I don't recall right offhand.
Okay, I'm drawing a blank myself. Okay.
Sorry,
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, was that the specialty prisons? Specialty courts you were referring to a moment ago?
Yes, I just wondered if somebody's on the working group from that working group. Excuse me.
Judge Brown is the one chairing that, and you mentioned he's not here, but he worked with our team early on to pull together a framework for specialty courts. And I know him and Sarah Hoskins from the court are taking the lead on drafting something that might, for you all to consider, that might relate to legislative changes and providing more support for jurisdictions around the state that are interested in starting specialty courts. And he's been leading the way on that. And I recalled that and wanted to make sure I chimed in and made that known also.
Well, thank you. Now you mentioned it, I do remember that. I'm, of course, the chair of the working group, I forget, is the judge. Awesome. So not good. But thanks for reminding me of that. And I do recall Judge Brown has mentioned that at multiple occasions, the work of that working group. So we'll look forward to hearing from them in next meeting. Okay, I believe that covers, Spence, I believe that covers your subcommittee. Anything else from you?
No, sir.
All right. let's see, so co-chair, vice chair, Steve Owens, Representative Owens regarding the Mental Health Substance Abuse Subcommittee. I'll turn it over to you, sir.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Stephen Owens, House District 74 Representative. I'm not going to spend a lot of time rehashing this because, as you all know, you got a copy of this presentation. I continue to give great kudos to the CSG team and the work that Patrick and his group are doing. They put forth a great presentation for us, and as you can see even in the overall presentation, the amount of emphasis on substance abuse and mental health that continues to drive a lot of these criminogenic trends. They put forth a number of opportunities to address, which led to some really great conversation within our subcommittee, specifically around leveraging access to telehealth and how this pandemic has actually driven us to more telehealth and the benefits therein. And I think that that's going to open up some doors for us legislatively. We also talked about Kansas Department of Corrections and policies as it relates to co-occurring disorders, which continue to be an ever-growing trend of people with mental health and substance abuse disorders, substance use disorders, and figuring out a way to further address that. We talked about CMHCs and their role in the process, as well as the mobile crisis team approach that is taken off in some areas and not so much in others, and what can be done to further exploit that. Talk more about just some of the metrics, some of the trends that we're seeing that you know, really incredible when you look at some of the data that's been shared in terms of the amount of substance abuse increases, the tie-in to the criminal justice system, increases in crimes, things like that. So some great information. We're going to continue to meet and refine recommendations as we begin to put those together and continue to work with Patrick and his team going forward. So is there anybody else on the subcommittee that has anything that would like to add to that?
Committee Chairman Owens, I just want to say thank you. You know, you and the committee and the CSG folks have been just outstanding at looking at alternatives for providing behavioral health care, including the telehealth, and, you know, getting some boots on the ground along with our first responders and others out there on the street to make a real difference, especially in upstream programs, crime prevention, you know, finding folks when they're at risk before they might commit a crime, who have, you know, folks with behavioral health problems, and getting them the services and quickly in real time. I just really appreciate the airtime and the big ears that you all have. Thank you so much.
Certainly. Thank you. All right. With that, Chairman Bennett, I will turn it back over to you so we can move forward.
Very good. Thank you. Let's see, data management. Well, Jennifer, I know you're on the call.
I am.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. So my availability during the election season has just been abysmal, so limited. And Bill Carr, Sheriff Carr, who's on the call now, has graciously agreed to step in and chair the committee instead. I don't know if there's a process we need to go through to make that shift or that change, but I appreciate him doing that so much. We can then utilize the offerings of CSG and other research opportunities. I just simply have not had time because of the election season to engage in. That said, Senator Wilborn, are you still on the call? Do you have any updates from post-audit?
If he is not on the call, I'd be happy to share what I know, Jennifer.
Thanks.
Representative Owens, again, as I've shared with the committee, and you weren't unfortunately able to be on the call, and totally understand that the legislative post audit has, they are not going to be taking up your request this year. They are filled with other requests, and unfortunately doing a study on data systems is not going to be within their availability this year.
Thank you. So I will, I'll get with Sheriff Carr, get all of the information over to him that I have amassed, and we'll get a call scheduled, a meeting scheduled, and have an update then at the next meeting. Thank you.
Okay. Reentry subcommittee. Well, I guess any other questions for Jennifer before we move on to the next subcommittee?
This is Todd Ackerman. You skipped me. Was there a reason? Did you want me to wait till last or?
Nope. I just just jumped right over you. Sorry about that. I'll jump back to you here in a second.
I thought maybe I talked too much and that's why you wanted me off.
Just, my eyes are getting tired. Anything else for the Data Management Subcommittee? If not, Chief, I will turn it over to you. And you're right, I missed you. Proportionality Sentencing Subcommittee.
Thank you, Chief Ackerman. We have not met since the last meeting that we had here. We did finally get the results back from the survey that we did. We surveyed judges, prosecutors, bids attorneys, private defense counsel, law enforcement, and some others chimed in as well, looks like, according to the survey. We do have the survey results here. I have them in front of me. I don't know if you want me to go through them all. I'd rather go through them after I present them to my committee. They have not seen them yet. I just got them back early this morning. And I'd like to thank Scott Schultz and his whole team did this for us. And they did a phenomenal job for it. It's 16 pages long. But I can tell you there was 275 people actually gave us their opinion on it. And there's over 100 responses to where you could type in at the end about your personal feelings about certain things that are happening. And I was amazed 101 people actually took the time to not only fill out the 6 questions, they actually left a response as well. Do you want me to go through that or would you like me waiting? I'd like to send it out ahead of time so people can see it.
Yeah, I think I mean, certainly not trying to hide the ball, but I think in the way we've got this set up for people who are chiming in here, maybe not been with us since the beginning, is, in one meeting a month for 2-3 hours, we're just not going to be able to devote all of our time to breaking down the details of each one of these subcommittees. And so we leave it to the subcommittees to do the work and then come back and present to us in a concise manner so that we all get the shorthand, but get the concise version of the work they've done. So rather than you go through 16 pages worth of material here and having members of your subcommittee hear it for the first time, I think consistent with how we've done things, I'll ask you to go to your subcommittee, present it there. Anybody who wants to hear it can chime in, can listen in at that point, and then be in a position to give us a summary at the next meeting, because at the next meeting we are going to be making some decisions, or at least forming the first stage of those decisions.
I think what I'll do is I'll send it out to Jordan and have him send it to not only the subcommittee, but the whole commission at the same time. That way, when we come back together, everybody will be on the same page with it then and be analyzed by then.
Very good. Makes sense to me. I will say, if there's something that jumps out at you, or an anecdote you wanted to share before you wrap it up, I certainly don't want to cut you short, but if you're just seeing it for yourself for the first time today and processing the information, I won't put you on the spot.
No, I am just seeing it for the first time today, but I really was excited when I see, law enforcement obviously chimed in pretty heavy, about 32%, but then we had a lot of judges at 24% also chimed in, and probably the two that deal with it the most besides the prosecutor. So I think it's going to be a really good results. I really do.
Okay, very good.
So, thank you.
Yep. All right. Now back, I think Professor Phillips was on the call for the reentry subcommittee.
Yeah, so our committee met on September 9th with Council of State Governments. There were a few things. I'm obviously not going to go through the whole presentation. That presentation was attached and sent out by Patrick Armstrong, but there were a few things that I'm going to highlight. One of them is that for housing, we have 20% of the people who leave DOC without stable housing. And so there are some things that were identified that we can actually work on. I don't know how many of them are going to be financially feasible, but there are some things we can work on. One that we can work on that would be financially feasible is to try to create some sort of a screening process, that there are people who are leaving jails and prisons and there's not, folks get together and there's sort of an oral conversation about how to track housing, but there's not set policies about how to track housing and making sure that people who are housing insecure have access. And so there's some need to create some policies. Unsurprisingly, probably, is that rural and Western Kansas have a harder time placing folks in those areas and finding them stable housing. And so there's an effort to track or to leverage with the Rural Prosperity Task Force. They have a housing and homeless subcommittee that we're going to try to coordinate with to find out some information, and maybe we can provide some additional services. We do know that there is a greater need for master leases. We know there is a greater need for housing specialists, and that wraparound services through KSHOP, which goes with 5 different counties, there's a greater need for that. They can't begin to meet the high demand for those areas. Of course, the problem we're going to have with some of that research and the numbers that come out of that is being able to fund it. The other thing I'm going to quickly mention about housing is the need to coordinate with Representative Owens and the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Subcommittee. That impacts greatly the ability of people to not just get a house and have housing and keep housing, but it also impacts their ability to have a job, which was the second thing that we talked about in our subcommittee, was education and employment. You just saw the numbers that came through with Patrick Armstrong about the number of people that are employed and the number of jobs that require high school diplomas. So there are significant barriers when 3,500 people are leaving the institution, our prisons, who don't have high school diplomas. There's also, as we've talked about before, the number of folks who are being kept out of particular jobs because they require licensing and certification. According to some of the Council of State Governments information, 34% of 102 of what are low or middle income jobs that might be accessible to folks require licensing and certification. So basically 1 in 5 jobs. So here's maybe the good news is that we sat down with Council of State Governments, and I've also hired a research assistant to do some looking for me into the 2018 statutes changes to licensing boards. We still have some problems. The good news is that we can make those changes without any cost. So there's maybe something that we can accomplish where we don't have to worry about funding. So some of the issues that we're having, there are shortcomings with that 2018 legislation. And there are a couple of states, Iowa in particular, that has a pretty robust set of statutes that we can look to see whether or not we can make some changes. So, for example, there is a lot of discretion still in what boards can use to prohibit people from entering or getting licenses. And so there's some changes we would like to see made. One is to the pre-application requirement. Right now, people can apply for basically an advisory opinion about would I be able to get a job in this sector. And those are not binding. So people can go through and get their cosmetology degree and then still be rejected later. And so maybe there's some ways we can change some of those statutes. There's some need to maybe tailor some of the exemptions and to provide a little more direction so that it's tied to public safety more. That licensing boards are looking for some direction, and so maybe we can provide that for them. So our next steps are really to sort of delve into that legislation and see if there's not something more that we can do to try and open up some places for folks to be able to get more jobs. And then, of course, we're through the Council of State Governments, who've been invaluable to us, is to reach out to more stakeholders for housing and see what we can come up with for housing. And finally, just quickly, I will add that there's some conversation we've had about looking into SNAP and TANF benefits. Currently, many of those benefits are denied to folks who have felony convictions, and whether or not there's a way to open up so that people have some access to food. So, maybe that can help get people on their feet a little bit. And there's also an effort by Council of State Governments to try to create a funding map to figure out where the sources of funding for housing and food come from throughout the state, so that we have some way to maybe come up with some consistent strategies across the state. And that's where we left it.
Okay, it's quite a bit. Thank you.
It was quite a bit.
Yeah, got a lot done. And it does sound like of all of the subcommittees, not to say your work has been easy by any means, but there's some very specific targeted legislation I think that could make an impact in this regard, maybe more so than any of the others, which is going to take a little more juggling. So, yeah.
I think that's correct. And some of those tweaks, especially to the 2018 legislation on licensing, that doesn't cost anything. So
will be well received, I would think.
Yeah.
Year of all year. Okay, any questions for Professor Phillips from anybody? Okay, then I will think, if I've not missed anything, then the last subcommittee was the Race and the Criminal Justice System Subcommittee. We've had a couple of 3 meetings now. I'm still chairing that for the moment. The groups have had several good discussions. The last meeting, we discussed, I think, let's put it this way, I think that the easiest way to put it is before we got into the more combustible issues, we identified over the first 2 meetings of the whole group. The first meeting actually was identifying members, and the next 2 meetings were where we got more into substantive questions. And some of the discussions had to do with data, trying to decide how it is that cities collect data. We got as granular as trying to decide, what does it mean to have contact? If an officer has contact, arrests, tickets being issued are one thing, and that's frankly accessible. That information is being collected right now, but contact, when law enforcement contacts somebody, are we monitoring that in some fashion? Is that data that can be collected? So we had the questions as to, what does it mean to really contact somebody? Just a conversation, or back, pull them over? I mean, what? So we got into those kind of discussions, and the real question is there a mechanism by which we can collect better data, have a more overview of what's going on in law enforcement and the interaction with all the various citizens, and broken down by race, gender, etc. The second large topic that was discussed was bail reform, and Judge Carol Arnold Berger, Court of Appeals, she has chaired an organization, a committee for the last, I think they've been at it for a couple of years now. We'll call it rough draft of her final report is out now for public commentary and is available to anyone who's interested in this subject. I think the consensus of this racial subcommittee was that while bail reform is very much an issue that's at the forefront of this subcommittee, that the work done by that other commission, they've had far more time and opportunity and information available to them to make recommendations. And so rather than jump into that, we probably won't re-plow that same ground, but would, given some time, would like to give them a chance for everybody to look through it. But would very much, I think the discussion was we would probably endorse it or recommend that the Reform Commission make some commentary about it in our December 1st final report, either endorsing it or at the very least bringing attention to it in a favorable light. Third overall discussion had to do with public defender system, the need for parity between county and district attorneys' offices rather and pay, and also the accessibility to a public lawyer statewide, the need for that, but then also Tabitha on this commission, the Smith County Attorney Tabitha Owens mentioned something that I thought was very well, something we all need to remember was that they don't have any public defenders up there, and they don't have access to any, and they don't have even a lawyer who's going to do defense work on felonies in that jurisdiction. They have to drive it from Salina, which memory serves was a 90-minute drive plus. So, other regional limitations that we need to address. And then, let's see here. I guess the last topic that we discussed with some degree of consensus was post-incarceration fees, fines. If there's a mechanism to reduce some of that burden on people coming out of incarceration, it really speaks to reentry, I guess, in a larger sense. But and that, again, I don't think that that's anything that's wholly different than what Professor Phillips' group has worked on. But just giving specific voice to it in this subcommittee was important. Juvenile justice, we didn't unpack that too much, but just the notion that criminal history does, even criminal history on a person felonies that take place in juvenile court does stay with a person, and the impact that has on then when they get to the adult status. So that was a discussion point. I don't know that we reached real consensus on it, but it was something we were addressing. And then finally, we did begin to unpack some of the more difficult topics to discuss. And while I don't know that we're going to reach consensus in the next meeting or so, we've also, I think it's clear that we have begun to breach issues that this subcommittee will get to in earnest next year if the commission is extended for a year, which again, we all believe should happen and I have reason to believe it will. But so that's the quick update, I think, from the Race and the Criminal Justice System Subcommittee. Any questions for me by anyone who was a member or chimed in or just has questions? Okay. Well, that leads us to the final point on the agenda. We're 4 minutes. Now, see, what are we now? We're actually an hour ahead of schedule, so we're doing great. Discussion of goals for the December 2020 final report. So for the October meeting, we're going to give again time to Patrick and the folks from the Center for State Government, and I'm also going to give, I think to start the meeting off, we're going to give Heather Cessna, the new chair of the Board of Indigent Defense Services, which is the head of the public defender system in Kansas. She's going to speak to us for about 15, 20 minutes, give us a quick state of the union for that organization and what their needs are, and then turn it over to Patrick and his group and give them some time. But as has been alluded to several times, we are rapidly approaching that December 1st timeline. I found today's presentation, I'll turn it over to others. I found today's presentation from Patrick and that group very informative. And I think that the information they have been providing and will continue to provide to the subcommittees will be informative for those groups as well. The question that it caused me to have though is essentially half a meeting next month and a full meeting in November. Is that going to be enough time? And maybe it's too early to say, but I do think we need to, I'll talk to Jordan about setting aside a date, but I just think there's a lot here, and then it should be a lot. But I'm wondering what the group thinks about setting aside maybe 2 meetings in either October or November. There's 2 ways to look at it. The earlier we go, then if that wasn't enough, we could add we'd have 2 meetings in October, 2 meetings in November. No one has time for more meetings, but at the same time, this is a lot to do. So just thoughts. Anyone, before I get a hold of Jordan offline and set things up, I'd like to hear from the commission. What do people think?
This Chief Ackerman, I would agree with you that some of these are very important topics. And if we have to push 2 more meetings, I personally have no problem with that, especially since we just brought online the race in the criminal justice system. I think we all know we're not going to fix that in 2 or 3 meetings. And I really hope we do get the extra year, but I think it's important enough that we do keep moving forward with it.
Chairman Bill Persinger here. I would agree with the chief. I'd sure make myself available for any and all meetings, and maybe even a long work or writing session that ideally would be done in person, but maybe that's not possible. But I'd sure go for whatever meeting time we need to get our work done.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Okay, well, I'll take everyone's, I think this is pretty commonsensical. I mean, we had a lot to do, and while the subcommittees have done a ton of work, we're gonna have to give them a requisite amount of time to articulate their thoughts and put it in such a fashion that it gets to Jordan and Bob and Natalie and the folks so that they have time to put it together. I will say, I'll remind everybody, some of you are new from last year, and those of you who haven't been with us from the beginning, we're going to Jordan sent out a framework, a form, so to speak, what the final report should look like, and obviously everybody's working toward that. And we'll get that out. But then the discussion, there's going to be points of discussion. There'll be points of agreement and points where there's not consensus. And so I think it just makes sense to me. We're going to have to set aside as much time as possible to make sure we have a product that is reflective of the amount of effort that's gone into this over the last 2 years. So Okay, well, I'll get with Jordan and we'll put out we've got the next date set already, but we'll look into seeing what's available for maybe 2 meetings in October, and then have, if nothing else, have a final one in November penciled in the event we need it. If we don't, all the better. But that way we're not down to we're not trying to ask for extra time in the first week of December, not getting this work done. So, all right. Well, is there anything else we did not cover that anyone wanted to bring attention of the commission as a whole on any subject, one of the subcommittees, working groups, anything that Patrick and his folks gave us today? Anything else that anyone wants to bring to the attention of the group?
This Chief, I just had one question. Jennifer and Steve Owens, about what do you think the state is not going to take up with the statistics or data? I missed exactly what he was talking about.
Sure, I'd be happy to chime in on that. Stephen Owens, 74th House District. Basically, any request by a legislator for an audit of any kind goes to the Legislative Post-Audit Committee, at which time the Legislative Post-Audit Committee then ultimately makes decisions on which audits should be a priority and which shouldn't. I know that they had an enormous amount of audits requested, and simply the request to study the data management systems throughout the state did not meet the cut for whatever reason.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I had somebody come in my office and I missed that while she was talking. Thank you.
Sure.
I will say, Sheriff, I know Bill just had to leave the call. He just texted me and let me know he's off. But Chief, you may, or I could get a hold of Kirk Thompson over at the KBI, but I know that they actually do track to some extent because of all the data that comes into the system from law enforcement agencies. They know what agencies have. Now, I think that Ms. Basinger's committee, their goal was to get a larger look than just law enforcement agencies. They wanted to know DCF, anybody who interacts with the criminal justice system. It would be nice to know what sort of data management systems, records management systems these various entities have, prosecutor's offices, court services, et cetera. But the KBI could at least give us a footprint of what the 400 some odd law enforcement agencies in the state are utilizing. So even though we were hoping the post audit would give us a plenary review of everything, at the very least we could get a sense of what maybe we even utilize a survey like was done for your committee, Chief Ackerman. So to find, to fill in the blanks elsewhere. So
Chairman, I don't want to belabor the point, but I did have a group with some philanthropic interest. So I'll circle back with them and see if that's an option for the study. And then the KBI person was in contact with me, and I'll circle back with them as well and pass all of that over to my new best friend in the world, Sheriff Carr.
Very good.
Hey, you might want to choose your friends.
Yeah.
Well, he's not here to defend himself, so.
No, he's not.
Anyone else have another question?
Chairman, this is Bill Persinger. Could you shout out the date and time of our next regularly scheduled commission meeting?
You would have to ask. Let me see.
I was digging a little bit, and it's probably there, and I just can't put my fingers on it.
Yeah, I think it is. Give me 1 sec. If Jordan has it faster than me, here we are. October 12th. Yeah, October 12th, and then November 9th and 23rd if needed. So we do already have, we already do have a backup date in November, but we might want to, like I said, I think the discussion today was we might want to have a backup date in October. Just, I'd rather have one more than we need than one less than we need. So
what was that? Was there a late November date in there as well? October
12th, November 9th, and then November 23rd as needed.
Thank you.
Chairman?
Yeah, go ahead.
Chairman, excuse me, this is Sylvia Penner. On the October 12th date, I show that that's Columbus Day, and so the State House will be closed. I think it's October 13th is what we had decided upon.
That may be right.
This Chief Ackerman, I can tell you both those days I'm out of town. I will probably have to have Carr or somebody report out for me. I'm in a training class. I'll be gone all week.
Okay. Sylvia, I'll get with Jordan and confirm whether it's the 12th or the 13th. when you mention that now, that does ring a bell. But to Bill Persinger's question, I will find out for sure, and we'll make sure that an agenda goes out fairly quickly with a reminder to everybody about the available dates this fall. And then the subcommittee report deadlines, looks like we've got October 26th as the report related deadlines. And then the draft would be sent to the members by November 2nd, the first draft at least of the report. Okay. Jordan, am I getting that all right?
I believe that's what we discussed, but we can discuss at length again. And
okay. All right. I guess the last question on that October 12th versus the 13th date would be, are you guys working if it's Columbus Day? And if the other discussion we need to resolve is whether or not, I think Zoom has worked remarkably well. And I think we've gotten a lot accomplished remotely like this, more so than I probably would have dreamed in March when this all began. This remote learning, remote meetings. But at the same time, when we're getting down to brass tacks, I think most of us agree being in a room together is a good thing if we can pull it off. Obviously, the 12th would not work for that. So I'll talk to Jordan, and we'll get with people and find out whether we're going to meet in person with Zoom as an option, or we're going to continue to go with Zoom into October with a formal in-person meeting in November. We'll get those details worked out. So, all right. If there's nothing else, going once, going twice. Anything else anyone wanted to?
Chairman Bennett.
Yes.
Chairman Bennett, this is Jean Phillips. Did you say, I just want to catch this, did Jordan already send out the format that he wants the report in, or he's going to send out the format he wants the report in?
Well, Jordan, I won't speak for you.
He's here. I'm sorry. Jordan, yeah. Did you already send it out, or does it need to come? Are you going to send it?
We're still working to confirm everything, Chairperson Bennett, but we'll send that out as soon as we can.
He's probably waiting on me to approve it, would be my guess. So.
Oh, just making sure I didn't accidentally delete it.
All right. Well, folks, thank you very much. Patrick Armstrong and all the folks at the Center for State Governments. I appreciate your work and your presentation. It's very informative and really does help us have a framework for moving forward and meeting our agenda, meeting our goal for this December 1st deadline. So thanks again, everybody, for the hard work, and we will talk again soon. Take care. Have a good afternoon. Good evening.
Thank you, Chair.